Welcome back to another podcast of Courage and Conviction. I'm Eric, my partner Jeff. We were talking about what causes people to walk away from their faith. And, as a nation in America and globally, but America, we are seeing less and less faith-based movements, more the opposite. We're seeing less faith-based movements rise up and actually control our culture today in this whole cultural war that we have out there. And we were discussing what causes people to fall away from their beliefs. And Jeff just recently, when's your book going to publish, Jeff? You're done writing it. You're just getting some final reviews right now, right? What's your timeline on publishing this? And then if you would, tell us a little bit about the book, because I know it's going to be about your life, which is both of our lives we're not normal, and I think that's why you and I coming together with this podcast brings a different spice and a different point of view to membership in our church, right, in the Lord's Restored Church, as well as but any faith, but not just that, but living outside of America for so many years of our lives and living under socialist governments, and I lived in 4 Latin countries, and some are more extreme than others as far as their governments go, and how that affected the church and church members, right? And so let's go back to your book, and we were talking in the last podcast of what causes people to abandon their faith today. So I'll give time to you, Jeff, and tell us about your book, what inspired that, and I think it's a really interesting story, actually.
Well, yeah, it is an interesting story. I can't say that I'm anybody, and I don't know why anybody would want to read my story, but there is a question, just like yourself. I mean, we both come from backgrounds of a lot of travel, especially in Latin America, and it's not something that everybody does. You being living in 4 different countries, that's amazing, and speaking, 3 different languages, at least, if that's not counting probably the indigenous tribes that you had to learn something where you were at. But as far as leaving the church goes, a lot of people are leaving, not just in our church, in the LDS church, but, throughout the world, people are leaving their Christian faith in droves. I'm not too sure about the other religions, but I think overall people are just becoming less inclined to stick with their religion. Coming back from a mission was difficult if you're not really converted. I think you can have a testimony and go out and teach the gospel, for a couple of years and come back and find out that your conversion is weak. That was just amazing to me. And that's, I'm looking at that in retrospect. My book, Reving the Soul, tells about that, a story about how I had left the church and I had become kind of hostile, toward the church over many, many years of being away from the church. It didn't start out that way, but I really blamed the church for a lot of my own shortcomings, for those of my fathers, who had been excommunicated from the church. But, he had always stayed in the church, despite being excommunicated. And when he died in Costa Rica in the early 80s, my mother finally came out and told me why. And I was floored, because here's this man that had never left the church, went through his own process, and I saw a level of repentance like I've never seen in anybody, even before that or even since that. That was just amazing. But when you realize your own sins and the sins of your fathers, and it can be kind of overwhelming. And in my case, the leadership when I came back from my mission wasn't really strong in the church, at least, in my situation. It was more a family kind of oriented church. There was not a lot of singles in the ward. And once I started going to college, I started getting this other ideas, that that kind of led me more away from anything theological. And we come back to church. I came back to church because I needed to, not because I was down and out. Maybe so emotionally and spiritually. That's where I was at, But I had enough money in the bank and had been living in Costa Rica, and I just I came back to church kind of like you did. A little bit of prompting and prodding from a local bishop who was from the U.S. side, and he would come over to our house and knock on the door or rap his keys on the outside gates. And back then I remember I was working fine dining and had, a glass of wine in my hand and a pistol in the other. And I think, it was just like a little BB gun kind of thing. But I thought about maybe shooting the fingers off the, whoever it was that was out there rapping on my gate at, 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night or whatever it was. It was late. It ended up being the bishop. And, he asked me this question. He goes, why don't you just come back to Jesus? And, I was hostile then. And he told me that, I was kind of like the natural man, and kind of read that scripture. And, I took offense to that, and it wasn't a couple of years later that I was actually starting going back to church and kind of realized where I was, spiritually back then. And I still do. I look back at that. You can't forget. So anyway, the book, starts out with this idea that that I'm mad at the world and I'm going to go back to Costa Rica. I've been living in Alaska, working as a chef up there, or I wasn't the chef, working for these man camps up on the North Slope in Alaska. And we would do these rotations of like 3-4 weeks on, 16, 17, 18-hour days, 7 days a week. And I was just making money and didn't really have anywhere to put it, except I wasn't really happy. So I wanted to leave the cold weather in Alaska and jump on a motorcycle and ride it down to Costa Rica and live on the beach. But,
and that worked out for you.
Well, I did it,
You took your motorcycle from Alaska and drove it all the way down to Costa Rica.
I did. People kind of don't believe me. There are a lot of people that don't understand, geography. They're like, well, what did you do? Drive through the ocean? I'm like, no, look at a map. I don't know. You can drive all the way from Alaska, all the way down to the US and I took the Pacific Coast Highway and then went down into Mexico, on the Nogales side, cut back over to the ocean on the Pacific side and rode it all the way down the Pacific Coast Highway, or the Pan American Highway, on the Carretera Libre, which they're not toll roads, but it was beautiful, and I have, the whole book has a lot of stories about how I did that. And I think I was smoking pot the whole way down and going over borders and just not at all, living up to the expectations that I would have had as a younger child as a member of the church. But by this time, it had been a couple of decades since my mission, and I really had no interest of ever going back to the U.S. because I was, politically brainwashed in this idea that Costa Rica had no army and, it had free healthcare and, free. And so when I got down there, and I immediately kind of met my wife, who was also an inactive member of the church, I found out later. And that's a story within itself.
Yeah, but that is too. We'll have to tell that story someday. That's interesting. That's cute.
Yeah. I think our Father in heaven knows us personally, even in our own rebelliousness, and I was always kind of the black sheep and wanted to be vocal about things. Once I got down into Costa Rica and my wife and I had been married for several years, the kind of business that I was in as a chef and the alcohol that's in that kind of environment and other things just kind of led me to being empty inside, spiritually and emotionally. And it wasn't great for our marriage either. So it helped us in our marriage tremendously when we came back to church. And we did that, at first I did that on my own because, um, you know, we were having difficulties in marriage. And one of the things that brought us back together was my conversion back to the church, and she had wanted that as well and was doing that on her side of things. But she didn't really think that I was willing to come back to church. And I think a lot of people didn't. My mother, years later said, well, of all of my children, and there's 10 of us, she goes, you're the last one I thought would ever come back to church. And I'm like, well, thanks. Thanks a lot, Mom.
Yeah, thanks, Mom.
Yeah.
So
anyway.
But so your book though is not just about your experience and your travels. It's pretty much it's a metaphor, if I may. It has your experiences and travels, but really you're trying to bring in your road back, your road out and your road back into the Gospels. Am I correct in that?
No, exactly. It is a memoir, it's in a sort of motorcycle diary, a real one, years ago, there was the motorcycle diaries with Che Guevara and that whole thing, where they were on the motorcycle for, 20% of the book. And then the rest of it was riding buses. I did motorcycles all the way down and lived it all the way there. And you remember I had my Harley, there. And I didn't have a car. And, but, coming back to church, I think all of us can relate to that. And all of us, they might not have ridden 10,000 miles to get from one country to the other and might not have been so drastic on a lot of things, but many people, a lot of people, especially young people that come home from missions, leave the church. And why is that? And I don't think that my story is any different than anyone else's when it comes to that, the real reasons for leaving the church. And it boils down to just being converted. And, we lose our testimonies, the ones that we thought that we had. And everybody can relate to that. It's a story that anybody can relate to. It's jam-packed with all kinds of adventure and there's a friend of mine that was reading their manuscript. He's like, wow, man, I just want to reach in there and say, and shake you, and say, stop making those decisions, and I'm like, well, at least you were reading them, and because he never left the church. He went on his mission to Denmark, but he speaks Spanish, has a Mexican wife, and there's a lot of things that we could relate to, but leaving the church was not one of them, but a lot of people do leave the church, and I wish it wasn't that way, but there's a lot of influences, outside influences, and we get attached to the world and what the world is trying to tell us, and it's a sad thing to leave the church. Coming back to church was the most amazing thing, and I know that both of us, when we were both coming back to church years ago, we discussed a lot of this, and some of it was kicking and screaming. At first, I didn't want to do it, just it was going to mean changing my life. But boy, did it change my life, and so much more for the better.
What I find funny, I remember a conversation you and I had. We're sitting in my backyard in the jacuzzi there in Escazú. And I remember this conversation we're having. I think it was kind of like the final one that both of us, from that point on, we both kind of seemed to make a stronger effort. We're sitting there talking about it and having kind of the same kind of conversation, talking about the church and why we left and so forth. And the question came up, the Book of Mormon. And I remember that question, and we started talking about, did we believe that the Book of Mormon was true? And I remember this, that both of us came to the conclusion right then that we did. Even though we had left the church, we could not deny the Book of Mormon. We never did. And it's funny because the Book of Mormon seems to be the stumbling block for many leaving, right? Or many coming in, when really for you and I, it was what brought us back.
Yeah.
And I think that's key today. I don't want to stop you from telling your story, but I remember that having that talk, and we'll get into that later on, and as we do more podcasts, and the importance of the Book of Mormon and why the emphasis now that that's our survival manual going forward. And what I think and what I found in my road coming back with the Book of Mormon. But I just want to make that point. I remember that was something that was key to both of us. Like, if we both know the Book of Mormon is true, then what are we doing?
Yeah.
And so, but then, okay, so we recognize that, Jeff. We came to that recognition, but that doesn't mean I get up tomorrow and I put on a suit and tie and I'm a different person.
Yeah.
Right? It's a process, not an event. So in your book, I imagine you cover your process back.
Absolutely. Yeah. It shows, I was, I had a lot of problems with addiction, and in the book, it's kind of raw footage there when it comes to that. And I'm very open about it. I chose to be that way because I think that there is a lot of addiction, whether it's, drugs and alcohol or pornography or a combination of things. And a lot of times it's not just one thing. Anger, I think within itself can be a form of addiction, and when I started coming back to church, I realized that my heart had softened. I became less angry. And, a couple of years later, I'm sitting in, Bishop Patey's office and he goes, how many days have you been clean now? And I thought about it. I'm like, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I stopped counting days a long time ago. And I realized that I had a testimony of the church and that I had been converted. And he says, when you've been converted and you have a testimony of the church, things like the word of wisdom become less of an issue. And in this case, there was that spiritual epiphany that it had dawned on me right then and there, and there's no words to describe it. We're sitting there in that office, and I realized that I never had to look back again. I never had to worry about, going and messing up because my testimony was there and strong enough, and the conversion had been solidified in a way that I never had to worry about, going back to the old ways. It is, and I'm still that way. I don't count days. I don't look back and think, I'm still an addict, because that's not the case. And I kind of describe that in my book as well. I think there's a lot of, different theories out there. Some of them are more mainstream, how people are kind of stuck in that rut. But just being converted, and the book in the end talks about how that comes to pass. When I started going back to church, I started reading every piece of anti-Mormon literature that I could get my hands on. It kind of shows that I didn't really want to legitimately go back to church at that point in my life. I was looking for reasons to not go back. And in some cases, in many cases, I was reading stuff. I'm like, well, that's not really true. They're taking bits and pieces of things and they're drawing conclusions of, I don't even want to spell it out here on this podcast because it was just absurd. Some of the things that is being propagated out there, and mostly in the Christian world, and these people that think they're doing good, talking about the church. I found that offensive, but I also found it in a way enlightening that, hey, maybe I have to really look and dig into the Book of Mormon again and get a new testimony of that. And you're right, the Book of Mormon, I always did believe the Book of Mormon was true. Even if consciously for a few moments in time, I didn't quite understand what that meant. But I have a brother, Mike, who's a great guy. He's been out of the church for a long time, and him and I were talking about the Book of Mormon. He goes, hey, I've always believed the Book of Mormon is true. I just didn't believe that Joseph Smith was a true prophet. I'm like, really? How do you come to that conclusion? Because if one is, you have to kind of, bite the bullet there and accept the fact that one doesn't come without the other. All that anti stuff is hogwash. It's just,
and that's so true, Jeff. And not to interject you, but just I guess I'm interjecting. Sorry, but if one can accept the Book of Mormon as being the Word of God, in addition to the Bible, right? So to make that clear for Christian followers, that in the church the Old New Testament, the King James version of it, we accept that just the Scripture just as much as the Book of Mormon and modern day Revelation, Doctrine and Covenants, or Christ, right? But and that's where ongoing revelation comes in. I guess that's the difference between us and Christianity, right? It's just that we believe there is modern day revelation. If you really want to run it down in a nutshell, and what that means, what that encompasses, versus Christianity itself doesn't necessarily really believe in modern day revelation necessarily anymore, right? And I'm glad for that modern day revelation, because I'm glad that I can actually receive inspiration, revelation from my life as well, in knowing that the Book of Mormon is true. But one has to really sincerely sit down and not just read that book as a story, but I look at that book as a manual, a guide for today. What's happening? Where's it coming from? Where are the sources at? And let me tell you, it opens a whole picture up. If you like this content, you want to follow us, just hit the subscribe button down below, please, and hit the bell. This is a new podcast right now. We're going to be recording every Saturday. We'll record a few videos each Saturday, get out to you, and then as things pick up, we'll record some more. Stay with us, and we'll see you in our next podcast with Courageous Conviction.